I felt for a long time, I described it to my therapist, that I had this frozen lake of pain that was just like right in the middle of my chest. I couldn't feel it, but I knew that it was there. The fear that if I were to access that I would just be overwhelmed by the grief, by the sadness. I was sold on the idea of like, okay, as scary as that is, maybe I do have to feel it. Maybe I do have to experience it. So how do I do that?
Orion Taraban, welcome to the space.
Thank you for having me, David. I'm excited to speak with you today.
You just said something interesting. Nobody wants to pretend, but we all have to.
Sure.
What is that? That sounds true. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, you can take it at so many different levels. I do think that pure, unvarnished contact with reality is probably not possible for human beings, nor is it necessarily desirable. Among other things, I think one of the most useful fictions that we have is a sense of self and an identity. And I sort of prescribe to a more Buddhist perspective with respect to that. It's that it's very useful for me to think that there is some sort of permanently enduring self inside of me, and to assume that one exists inside of you, despite, let's say, no empirical evidence to support that belief. And so there are certain, we can call them fictions, that make life meaningful, that make life interesting, and that make life possible. I don't think we can live without fictions.
Yeah, there's a saying that I've heard that I really like, that what's useful is more important than what's true. And I guess implied there, at least the way I think about it, is getting to the truth is pretty much impossible. So if you apply strategies that are useful, in some sense, they must be true in the sense that they give you the outcome that you want, which would then indicate you have an accurate map of reality.
Yeah, that is interesting. It's like, if something works, could it truly be false? Or else, how else is it really engaging with reality to move the needle? Which suggests that maybe there's a post-empirical metric of truth that we just haven't commonly accepted. And I can understand why, because we're entering into non-verifiable territory, and then people can make all kinds of claims, and it's hard to know which is true and which is useful. But absolutely, I have sort of like a quadrant here where, I examine my thoughts and the beliefs for whether they're true or false, but also useful to useless. And obviously the false, useless beliefs we want to get rid of as quickly as possible. We want more of our beliefs to be true and useful, but not everything true is useful, and not everything useful is true.
It's true. Yeah. Well, you're putting out a lot of useful information right now. Well, it is the practical strategies, the practical frameworks that really, I think, are showing. I mean, we've seen some of this before, but not in the way that you articulate it, and certainly not with the style that you articulate it, because a lot of these ideas are very confronting to a lot of people. They run counter to some of the narratives that are out there, but the dynamics between men and women, and you're kind of cutting right to the heart of it, at least in one perspective. So, how is that for you, that your work is having such an impact?
I'm not really sure. I've been very fortunate with the channel. I was certainly talking to the void for quite some time before the Psychax got any traction whatsoever. And what was the secret sauce? I think on some level it was consistency. It was persistence and a little luck. I think I have a bit more credibility than some folks who talk in the space of intersexual dynamics because of my academic background. I'm not like a Andrew Huberman channel. I'm not translating studies to the lay population. I think there's a lot of problems with basing your models of realities on randomized controlled trial results. We can get into that if you'd like.
Well, I saw you talk about that on Joseph's podcast, and I really like what you said.
Oh, I'm glad you watched that. I thought that conversation with Joseph was really interesting because I got out onto topics that I don't often discuss: consciousness, psychiatry, and its foibles. Yeah, that's how we know each other, right? Because we have our mutual friend, Joseph.
Yeah.
Common.
Well, just
Good
you were
guy.
saying that these studies are essentially they're unreliable, that it's almost impossible to remove the human bias from the study in the evaluation of the results or the setup of the experiment. That wasn't your language, but that's how I heard it.
Well, that's certainly true, but I would go one step further. It's not that these people are even necessarily trying to be unbiased, and generally the result precedes the experiment in the vast majority of studies. And given my understanding of research design and statistical analysis, is I could make any study prove whatever I want, basically, and I could hide it in a way that even folks who are knowledgeable about statistics and research design might find it difficult to know how I fudge the numbers to get the outcomes that I desired. And it would certainly be invisible to the average person.
Then how do you sort of test your own theories and wisdom? Like, by what? How do you measure them for validity and truth?
Yeah, for me, what really started to turn my life around, especially in the domain of dating and relationships, was was to surrender my models. Like, my models are what had led to my lack of success in that space. I thought that I knew what women wanted. I thought I knew what caused relationships to succeed, and my models and assumptions of reality preceded reality. And after just one more instance of not getting the desired outcome, I said, well, screw it. It's like, if I knew how to do this, I wouldn't be in this situation. So maybe my fundamental assumptions about women and relationships and dating are wrong. So I'm going to approach this in the true spirit of science, which is I don't know. And I'm going to let the outcome of the experiment guide my process and to build my my models of reality based on what worked. And that led to some very, sometimes uncomfortable and counterintuitive places. But that's sort of my model of truth is, does the plane fly? Like, I don't want to hear anybody's theory of aerodynamics if they haven't gotten into the plane that was based on that principle and they could fly across the Atlantic. And if they can fly across the Atlantic, but they can't define the model of reality upon which that is based, that's more trustworthy for me than somebody who's just theorizing over here.
Interesting. I assume you got into this, you became curious about all of this to solve, well, you suggested that, a problem that you had.
Sure.
Trying to relate to women, trying to navigate the relationship world. Is that what initially led you into all of this?
Oh, yeah. I talk about it on the channel that, to the extent that I possess wisdom, wisdom is pain plus insight. And the reason why I've worked so hard is a self-interested problem. It's that I was experiencing pain and a lack of success, and I wanted to solve that issue, to get out of pain and to get what I wanted. And it didn't happen right away, but over the years, I think organically developed a model of dating and relationships that seemed to be associated with consistent success. And it's really turned this franchise around.
I'm guessing that you now get a lot of female attention.
I do. I get reached out a lot on social media in particular. Mm-hmm.
It's got to feel good.
Sure. It's, if nothing else, it's a validation that what I'm saying is accurate. It is really interesting, though, because all of a sudden
you're also charming, and
I'd like to think so.
And probably, as your book suggests, you've mastered to some degree the art of seduction.
I've gotten much better at that. I do have more experience than the average person. I think being an actor helps. It helps you to get out of, let's say, your habitual behavioral repertoire and to be more flexible with your presentation of self, because nothing works on everyone, but everything works on someone. And, I don't know if you've gotten to that chapter of the book about the game of please no, is that the more strategies that you have and the more flexible you are at deploying them based on the interpersonal feedback you're receiving, the more likely you can lead towards the desired outcome.
Interesting. Yeah, I want to talk to you about your life as an actor, because I was an actor for a long time.
I heard. Yeah, we have a lot in common in that capacity. And then you got into therapy, right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. But I want to touch on this idea, and I think I heard it in the book or maybe from one of your lectures, I think it was from the book, about awareness. Like sometimes awareness is, it's a disadvantage. Like knowing what we're doing gets in the way of what we're doing. Did I read that right?
Yeah, talk about that in chapter 1 about which is probably the most complicated chapter in the book, about the sort of value calculus that goes on behind the scenes and how we don't generally need to be aware of the billions of little weighted calculations that our perception is recalculating anew dozens of times every second. We do need to be aware of sort of the summation of those calculations, because those lead to important consequences for the individual in reality. Should I approach this? Should I run away from this? And what I posit is that all of these calculations sort of get transmuted into an emotion.
Right.
And as long as we're aware of what we're feeling, we don't really need to be aware of what caused that feeling to fluoresce inside of us, which is why the typical experiences of feelings, especially attraction, is just that it sort of like comes out of nowhere. People generally experience their emotions to be spontaneous. And if you ask them why they feel a certain way, maybe they can give you one or two post hoc rationalizations, but they're very easily disproved because they don't feel similarly under those conditions when they're replicated with a different person. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So I do think that self-awareness has its limits, in that, but it is a useful tool if your unconscious programming has been skewed or trained on bad data.
Right. Right. So emotions are a signal. It's information. It's data, and I guess the awareness comes from understanding what that signal means and how to act on it.
Yes, I think that there's two components. That's true about emotions in general. Like, for example, if I feel fear, the impulse inside of that emotion is to run away, or to at least gently avoid contact and get out of there. The question is the programming that gives rise to the fluorescence of fear inside of me completely aligned with reality? Or am I becoming afraid inappropriately? And that takes longer to suss out, and different people have different programming, obviously, and sometimes their emotions are more or less in line with reality. They can trust them. They can trust that this is an actual threat that I need to avoid, versus something that's not an actual threat, but the alarm bells inside of me are ringing off because this seems familiar based on my family of origin and my limited data set that my programming was trained on. So self-awareness is useful to kind of figure out to what extent our programming is aligned with vertical reality.
And I guess what you're describing it's how I think about therapy. It's going in and trying to understand the bad programming, the false conclusions, the distorted belief systems that we have that are causing us frustration in reality, to become aware of them and then change them. Is that how you think about therapy?
Therapy is definitely helpful for bringing that kind of self-awareness to the individual, facilitating it. But as I talk about in the first chapter, that's not necessarily sufficient to actually change the feeling or even to change the behavior. Like, a woman could go to therapy for years and learn how she's attracted to narcissistic, manipulative men because it reminds her of her alcoholic father, and her mother told her in so many ways that this is just how women should behave, and they should be doormats and long suffer, etc. And she could potentially speak that with all kinds of insight and therapeutic language, but she could still find herself authentically attracted to narcissistic, manipulative men.
She can't stop it.
She can be aware of it, which actually could be kind of torturous. Like, if I'm a machine, I'd rather not be a self-aware machine who's aware of its own deterministic patterns. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I don't think that awareness by itself is sufficient to change people's patterns. They actually have to do something different enough times and to collect more good data to kind of drown out the bad data that they were trained on, because for better or for worse, we can't actually delete or erase that stuff. So ultimately, it means doing something despite your feeling, which is one of the hardest things for people to do.
Yeah, that's exactly what I say to my clients. At some point, you're going to have to take a risk. You're going to have to do something different. Otherwise, you're just going to stay stuck in the pattern.
The problem with dating and relationships, sorry to interrupt, is that for a while, there's this really bad Hobson's choice. So, for example, this hypothetical woman who's attracted to these manipulative men, she might feel that desire for a particular individual and say, no, I'm going to be I'm in healing, I'm in recovery, I'm going to resist that emotional impulse. I'm going to date that good, loving, nice guy over there. And she's going to say that, he's a great man on paper, he treats me really well, but I feel nothing for him. And so for a while, she's going to believe that the choice is between, let's say, a dysfunctional exploitative relationship that she actually feels something for, she feels alive, she feels that love and attraction, or somebody who's very good on paper that she's just bored and disinterested by. And until the programming is sufficiently healed, that's going to be the experience. I do think that it's possible to change authentic desire to an extent, but that it can take years. And it generally does require kind of dating the boring person for a while, resisting the impulse to get involved with the wrong person, and to continue to understand where some of these emotions are coming from.
Yeah, well, that was my pattern. I would date quote unquote, crazy, unstable women. And I was aware of the pattern, but I couldn't stop being attracted to them.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually I had to tell myself that if I felt that charge, a strong charge in relationship to a woman, that was in fact a red flag,
mm-hmm.
and to move away. Although it was difficult because my mind is, telling me a story that, well, if you're this attracted to somebody, they've got to be good for you. And eventually I did make that transition. I don't want to call my wife boring. She's not boring at all, but it was a different dynamic that I had to get used to. And I didn't trust it at first, but I just kept showing up and saying, well, no, I want to see her again. I want to see her again. I had a good time. And there was enough chemistry to keep it going. And now I'm in a very happy, very stable, very fulfilled relationship. But it took me a long time to sort that out.
I hear you. I think that boring becomes peaceful once people have healed some of that stuff. I think they're kind of two sides of the same coin. And until a person has matured and healed some of their emotional wounding that might make them more compelled to seek out dysfunctional relationships, peaceful does look boring. But once you kind of mature and grow and heal, boring can look very peaceful and desirable. But I'm with you, man. It's and it could be that we were both actors, and actors aren't really known for their emotional stability. It's kind of a liability in a profession where you're supposed to assume different roles. You need to be very flexible and fluid with respect to your emotions and your personality, et cetera.
Well, I think it was Marlon Brando who said the desire to be an actor is an erotic impulse, and giving it up is a sign of maturity. So we both have that.
Yeah, I do miss performing from time to time, but I don't miss being an actor. It's a very hard life.
Yeah. Well, how did you get into it? What drew you to acting, and what was that like for you?
Oh, the origin story for acting is not so noble. So I was forced into acting by my school. All the students were required to take drama for a semester. And at that point, I think I wanted to be a scientist. I thought the arts were silly and stupid, but I saw this as a necessary obstacle for me to get through to move on with my education. And I remember for a semester we got together and we were rehearsing this really terrible Western melodrama, and I got cast as the villain's bumbling henchman. And I thought, okay, this isn't easy. I just memorize these lines. I stand here, I say the line when it's my turn to speak, and okay, we'll get through this. And even though we were rehearsing for a show for 3 months, and I knew that we'd be performing in front of an audience, I remember the day of the show peeking out from behind the curtain and seeing it looked like every person on the planet was out there and their friend, and I got the most terrible stage fright. My heart was beating, I was nauseated. I honestly didn't think I could do it, but I knew I wouldn't be able to live that down. And I wasn't the most popular kid in the school anyway. So, no matter how, so I just basically made a promise to myself that all I just need to do is survive the next 2 hours and I'll never fucking do this again. So I was so scared that I went out there, and I couldn't do what I had rehearsed to do. So like when it was my turn, I couldn't look anybody. I was too embarrassed. So I just closed my eyes the whole time and I clenched my fists. And when it was my turn to speak, I just like shouted out my lines, which completely freaked out all of my co-stars. Uh, they didn't know what was going on, but the audience didn't fucking know what I was supposed to be doing. And they thought it was a character choice and that it was hilarious.
How old are you at this point?
This is 7th grade. So I was like 12 or 13.
Okay.
And I won the drama award that year because I think that even though everyone who was involved in the process knew that things had gone sideways, they had to get behind sort of the popular reaction to what happened. And so I was invited back the next year. And to be honest, this was the first time that I experienced positive social feedback. And it was like people were coming up to me. They thought I did a good job. They wanted me to join them. And that was kind of intoxicating. So even though I felt my life flash before my eyes the first time I went on stage, I was like, man, this is the best that I've experienced socially in a long time. So I might as well keep going. And over the years, the stage fright began to ebb and I started to get more authentically interested in drama. And I decided to go to NYU and study acting at a conservatory there. And I was a professional actor in New York for about 11 years. So I'm really grateful for the experience. It taught me so much about myself, and it's taught me a lot about being a therapist too. Like it was an excellent preparation.
Yeah, I feel the same way. What has it taught you about being a therapist? How's it helped you?
I think first and foremost, it's helped me with perspective taking and empathy. Like to inhabit a character well as an actor, you can't really judge the person. Certainly the character that you're designed to portray thinks that they're right and that their worldview makes sense, even if they're the villain of the story, right? So to be able to kind of see things from another person's perspective that might be radically different from yours without judgment, I think is first and foremost what makes for effective therapy. So that's one.
Mm-hmm.
Two is I think it's helped me to become a more effective communicator. So I've studied voice, I've studied facial expression. I could be the most compassionate, warm, understanding person in the world, which I'm not, but I could be. And if I wasn't able to communicate that to another person, it would almost be wasted. It'd be like $1 million in a vault at the bottom of the sea. So for better or for worse, it might actually be more useful to folks if I can express understanding than to actually be understanding.
Yeah.
Of course, it would be best if I have both. But it's more useful to the client if I express it and don't feel it than I feel it and don't express it.
Well, there is a performance aspect to being a therapist because in some sense you are an avatar and they're projecting onto you. And so you're holding a screen in some way for them. And, all those things, tone of voice, facial expressions, how you dress, how you present yourself, it all has an impact on their experience, positive and negative.
Certainly. You're using some psychoanalytic terms there, which is very far away from how I practice. It's how I thought I was going to be. This is interesting. So one of the reasons why I got into psychology is because I was helped very much by my own therapy in my 20s. And I'd seen a few people in my early 20s, and I think the best that I could say for them is they didn't make me worse, though maybe a couple of them did. Like I actually ended up, I think, not as good as when I started. But when I found somebody that I felt could really help me, and I felt that from the very first session, I worked with him for like 7 years, and he was a Jungian dream analyst. So every hour we would get together and I'd tell him some background of my life, and then I'd tell him a recent dream and we would analyze that together. In the beginning, he would analyze it. Then as I got more advanced, we would analyze it together. And because that was really my model for effective and successful therapy, I thought that I was going to be like him. And so the first couple of years when I was in grad school, starting my internships, I was doing my best to sort of channel my own therapist because it's just a very strange profession, David. It's not like, it's very rare for therapists to know if they're actually any fucking good. You don't get to see what anybody else does, like by definition, because of the confidential nature of the work. So I think it's also very easy for people to think that they're doing a great job, and maybe they're not, because what's the point of comparison? What's the feedback? But it took me a while to, sorry, one last thing is it took me a while to find my professional voice, and it's very, very different. Like I'm 180 degrees away from Jungian psychoanalysis, though I think it's very interesting.
Well, this might be inside baseball between two therapists, but how did you find your voice? What is your voice? What's your style? How do you think about it?
I was really frustrated by this sort of unspoken law among therapists that you should never be directive. And I was working with some folks who had serious dysfunction, and it just felt so ineffective to not be directive from time to time. It's like the person could have their hand on a hot stove and the skin is searing off, and a traditional therapist be like, well, for your consideration, I wonder if you're feeling an impulse inside of you to potentially move your hand. When really the most empathic thing to do in the real world would be to smack that person's hand off the stove as quickly as possible. And that, from a therapeutic perspective, might be a violation of the autonomy of the patient. You know what I'm saying? So I understand that it's not a black and white issue, but I felt that if I was waiting for the client to come to the insight or awareness, him or herself, organically, we're going to be here 3 or 5 times longer than we need to. And actually, is that ethical? Especially if I believe that there's a more direct path to patient improvement, why not take it? Like, there's enough disordered folks in the world. I'm not concerned about losing a patient.
Well, this gets into the heart of the criticisms around therapy, because it's everywhere right now. There's a lot of pushback.
Well-deserved criticisms. I think
I agree.
We've overextended. Sorry to interrupt.
Well, what is it? What do you think? What's your criticism of therapy? I mean, I guess you just said it. It's too much affirming, not enough directive.
There's so many criticisms that you could level. That's one of them, where like bad therapy is just the therapist is a for your experience and validates your feelings and doesn't ever challenge your perspectives or doesn't actually give you directive advice that could move you in the direction of your stated objectives. It's just, I can see how you feel that way. That must have been very hard for you. It's basically like you're right, which is a very feminized way of communication. It's like, that's the old joke between the husband and the wife. The wife's saying the problems. The husband starts offering solutions. The wife says, I just want you to listen. It's like, of course I'm listening. That's why I'm offering these reality-based solutions. No, I just want you to listen. Well, how is that going to change anything? And it's like, so I think it's a very feminine profession.
Mm-hmm.
I have some theories as to why that has become the case. And I think feminine communication is less about problem solving and more about emotional coping. And a lot of women just want to be told that they're right.
Yeah, it's funny. I just had a meeting. I have a little business venture with two women, and they're close friends, and I love them. But in the business context, they were leading the meeting, and there was so much emphasis on maintaining the emotional connection, validating feelings. And as a guy, I'm like, we're in business. Just what's up? Just tell me what's going on. Like, I didn't need any of that. And in my mind, I felt this judgment and I wanted to stop it. And then I realized, like, oh no, this is how they do it. And I need to give them space to be that way. And it's important for them. But for me, it felt, I don't want to say ridiculous, but it felt like a waste of time.
Well, yeah, I've done thousands of consultations at this point with men and women, and it's very often the case that a man will start the consultation and say something like, Doc, don't worry about my feelings, like hurt my feelings. Give me the truth that no one else is telling me, because clearly I don't know what is going on. I've never had a woman start a session that way.
Yeah. Yeah. So the profession is feminized. I mean, I don't know, 70, 80% of therapists are
85% the last time I checked.
Oh, really? 85% are women. So you can understand why men don't want to go to therapy. But why is that? Why you say you had a theory about this? Why is it 85% women?
Well, I think we've moved away from psychology attempting to be a hard science. I mean, if you look at the first half of the 20th century, Freud did his best to try to ground psychiatry and neurology. There was the behaviorists, there were psychometrics. It was very empirical. Therapy got taken over in the sense that it was a caring, healing profession. It became less science and more of an art, which maybe it always was to begin with. I think it was inappropriate to kind of clothe therapy in a lab coat, as it were.
Right.
But my theory about that is it goes back to Anna O, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
No.
Oh, maybe I'll just jog your memory or I'll teach you something new. But Freud, when he was sort of like experimenting with talking as a road to the cure, he often had to work with the only people who were willing to work with him. And as a Jew living in Vienna and dealing with the anti-Semitism at the time, that basically meant women, because most Gentile men would not go see a Jewish doctor. So the majority of his practice were women. The majority of his practice were, let's say, middle to upper class women, because originally therapy occurred 5 days a week. It wasn't a once a week thing. It was 5 consecutive days a week for 1 hour. So these are women who had the time and the resources to consent to that kind of treatment. So that's important to understand. But, he was trying out various things. And one of the great things you can say about Freud, he was very open to experimentation and leading where his thoughts and outcomes led him. And he was trying something out on one of his female patients that we know as Anna O. And basically in mid-session, she was just like, hey, just shut the fuck up. Like, just stop trying with whatever your theories. Like, just fucking shut up and listen, basically, nicely. I'm sure she didn't say that in the, 1900. But Freud was like, okay, well, this won't hurt. I guess I can give it a shot. And so he just sat there quietly and she talked for an hour. And at the end, she says, wow, I feel so much better. And Freud was like, yeah, there is a decline in her neurotic symptomology. And so it's like, that's where the talking cure was born. I think it was a very gendered expression of therapy, which is women sometimes just need the space to talk it out. But I think a lot of men look at therapy and say, why would I pay $200, $300 to just tell my problems to a guy who's going to reflect back, that sounds hard. Like I think I'll be happier with the $200. Like that doesn't sound useful at all. And I think we've moved away from therapy as problem solving, therapy as directive. That's why I basically say that what I do is therapeutic coaching. Is I give people assignments to do afterwards. They don't have to. I ask that they at least be willing to try everything out. But if it doesn't work, they can throw it away. And if it works, great. We'll keep doing it, and we'll keep fiddling with the knobs until they get what they want. And let me tell you, some guys, especially minority men, non-white men, are much more open to consultations and coaching than therapy. If you just start calling that therapy, a lot of guys are just going to say, no, not for me, no thank you. But you call it a consultation or a coaching session, and they'd be more interested in listening.
That's interesting, because I think a lot about that. I mean, fortunately for me, I had that interview with Andrew Tate, so it kind of gave me credibility in this space, because he seemed to it worked, and he liked me. So the Tate fans, I have a lot of young men now
That's
who've
great.
come to me. Yeah, it is great. That's a really interesting thing. I mean, so a big part of it is how you frame it. Well, not just the frame, but the approach. Although I guess there is something to be said for listening, because what I find is that a lot of men have never been listened to. They've never been heard. Their experience hasn't been validated, and they feel alone in it. And that aloneness creates a kind of shame. So like when I'm working with people, the first thing I'm trying to do is I'm trying to listen to their story and just be understanding, to gain that trust before I begin more directive measures. But there is a lot of sad, lonely dudes out there who don't know who to talk to, have no one to talk to, don't even have any relationship to their emotions, don't understand how their childhood impacted them. And do you think about that?
Oh, sure. You certainly have to validate before you attempt to change. Like
Right.
acceptance interventions always have to come before change interventions. So that's certainly true, and it's a part of what I do. I don't just lead with trying to give people advice,
Of
you know.
course.
But I do think that advice and directiveness has its place.
Yeah. Well, I
Sometimes it
guess
is
I'm
important.
speaking. I guess I just to frame it. I guess I'm just speaking to the crisis among men right now on a broader scale. Like, what do you think is going on there?
I think there's a lot of things going on. Um, I don't. I don't think that. I think men are confused and they're isolated, and I think those two things in conjunction lead to a lot of poor outcomes in them.
Were you confused and isolated as a young man,
Oh yeah, absolutely.
and that's why you started going to therapy?
Um, I had a very tough adolescence. I went through a lot of bad things, hard things. Let's put it that way. And I was also very stubborn and proud. So I resisted help for many, many, many years. And it was only when I got to a place where my life was actually unbearable to continue that I was willing to entertain the possibility of talking to someone else about it. But I had to reach that point. And my hunch is that a lot of guys are like that too. Like you'd have to come to the brink of your own dissolution to be willing to accept a helping hand. I wish it weren't the case. I can look back at myself and call myself stubborn. Um, I wish I had accepted help earlier, but I also know that, that's who I was at the time.
Did you know that you were troubled? Did people around you know that you were troubled? I mean, I don't know if troubled's the right word.
I was troubled. Yes, but they didn't know what to do about it, right? So I was dealing with things that as a teenager, every once in a while, I would try to confide in some of my close friends about what I was going through at home and some of the things that I was thinking and feeling. And they just looked very awkward and unsettled and uncomfortable. And I came to realize that the things I was going through, well, not uncommon to the human condition, there was no one in my high school who was dealing with the shit that I was dealing with. And they just didn't know what to say. They didn't know what to do. And so they just often withdrew. It's sort of like when people don't know what to do around death because they don't really have any close and personal experience with that. And so they don't want to say the wrong thing. They're afraid of putting their foot in their mouth. So they just don't say anything. And so, anyway, from my social feedback at that time, I realized that I felt very alone because no one could sympathize with even remotely about some of the things that I was going through. And so I just stopped talking about it. I stopped talking about it. It didn't make the problem go away, you
Hmm.
know? But I think what made the problem go away was not talking about it. It was, I think that was a component of healing from that. But I think it really got better when I stopped doing certain things to numb the pain and cope with the problem and to move in the direction of more constructive habits and action.
Did you have a moment where you realized like hope was possible or felt inspired to make a change?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So it's like they say in AA, sometimes a person's bottom is uh, like a jewel. It's a precious treasure. It doesn't feel that way at the time by any stretch of the imagination, but it can keep a person sober and on the right path 20, 30, 40 years down the line. And I can think of a moment where, the inflection point of my life, it didn't get worse than that. Thank God, because my life was just unbearable at that point. Now, it didn't get better right away, but it never got worse than that. So I
Are you
mean, it's
afraid that I guess you're very stable and successful now, but I know for me, because I had moments like that, there was always that fear as I was, getting better or growing or changing and becoming more confident that like I was going to slip back into it or something bad was going to happen again. It's almost an anticipation of the pain or the cycle repeating.
I don't think I've ever been that afraid of that. Um, I think it's more just feeling somewhat haunted by the sins of your past, as it were,
Mm.
and to what extent is something that I did 20, 25 years ago, is that going to undermine my credibility or all the progress that I've done in the minds of others?
Yeah, I can relate to that. Uh, and now you're a public figure. You're out there for the world to see. It's a lot of exposure and a lot of admiration, but I'm sure a lot of criticism. How is that to have that kind of attention and become an expert in the world? And you're I'm appearing on all the top podcasts. Everybody wants to talk to you. How is that experience for you?
I don't know if I'm that popular, but it has been nice to get invitations. It's really great to feel that other people care about what you have to say, and I do think that's a fairly recent phenomenon for me. And I don't know if many people, men and women, actually get to that space where someone's actually authentically interested in their point of view. Maybe their friends and partners or close family if they're lucky, but random strangers interested in what you think and what you have to say, it's quite a privilege. Um, how do I deal with the criticism? So I have been fairly fortunate, as on the whole, my feedback has been quite positive. The algorithm is very good at putting my content in front of people who I think are most likely to benefit or enjoy it. So, on the channel anyway, it's 98, 99% positive. But when I appear on other podcasts and get in front of audiences that aren't as siloed as my YouTube channel, it can produce some negative feedback. I remember the first time I appeared on Soft White Underbelly, which was probably my most controversial interview to date. I woke up and the next day there was like 50,000 women who were just furious with me, and I'd never had the experience of 50,000 people being upset with me before. That was a new one, and but what's really interesting is, at first it's like, oh my God, uh, there's this sort of panic, or my heart starts beating fast, and I'm thinking, oh my God, these people really don't like me, and I do think that it's like building a resistance to iocane powder. The more that you kind of come into contact with it, the less that it stimulates any kind of physiological response. I think that's where I've gotten to at this point after about a year and a half. Um, and I think it's actually easy because a lot of the negative criticism, it's not very substantive. Usually when people are negative, they just resort to name calling. They call me all kinds of names, or they attack how I look or how I sound, or et cetera. And to my mind, there's no better confession that you're out of arguments than resorting to ad hominem attacks. So if I felt that the criticisms I were getting were thought out and substantive, it might give me pause in what I'm arguing. But just being called names, it's not very. I don't enjoy it. I don't. It's not very pleasant, but it's hard to take seriously, to be honest.
Right, but but the first time it happens, it is a little disturbing because I've certainly had it, and I've had to become a little more Teflon about it.
Well, I'm sure you. I don't know, but I imagine that you have it not because you have your beliefs or your ideas per se, but maybe because you're guilty by association. Just like even speaking to a man like Andrew Tate makes you an irresponsible misogynist because you are giving that kind of a person a platform for his ideas. And I don't think that they might even listen to the interview. They might just see that you're hosting Andrew or somebody else and say, and make their own judgments about that. I don't think that the people who call me names really listen very carefully to what I have to say.
Well, they probably can't hear it because they're so rooted in their own ideology, and it taps into something that's painful for them. That they just can't confront. Because that's what you're doing. I mean, you're getting a receptive audience, but breaking down romance. I mean, I did a lot of Hallmark movies. I know.
You did? Like actual Hallmark movies?
Oh,
That's
dude,
hilarious.
I had a run where I was like, one of the guys. I was like the guy.
Were you the small town guy with the good heart, or were you the corporate
small
lawyer?
Town carpenter. I was always the hero, the regular guy, and the busy city girl came in, and I remember, and this was kind of at the end of my career, but my whole career was sort of women's television. Gilmore Girls is what I'm best known for. But I remember at one point just feeling like, I don't want to participate in this fantasy. It doesn't feel good. It's not reality. I understand it's candy for women, but there was something almost that felt like unethical for me.
No kidding.
Because I didn't feel good about myself, especially as I was learning more and more about psychology and just trying to understand the truth and struggling with my own relationships. So I had a real crisis there. And so when I think about, your work, which really gets down, the sexual marketplace, and breaks it down in a very direct way about what our unconscious motivations are, talking about power, talk about we're trying to get the best choice that we can get. That really flies in the face of the Hallmark romance movies, and I can imagine people that are tied into that are going to they don't want to look at that. They don't want to face it.
Yeah, I talk about that in the introduction, where it does feel like I'm dissecting a sacred Hindu calf on some level, and it's in the service of preventing idolatry, which we might think is a very, let's say, noble or a high-minded goal, but certainly people are attached to that totem, and they suffer when it is destroyed, or at least revealed for what it is. I think romance can have its place in people's lives. But I think that, if someone really were to buy into the Hallmark fantasy, if they were a woman, what are they going to do? Just like hang around a small town and wait for their meet cute?
Maybe it's one of the reasons that women are so unhappy right now. They've been fed a stream of bullshit about how relationships are supposed to be.
Well, no argument there. Sure. And men have been fed a line of bullshit too. And I think the lines of bullshit are a little bit different that men get told and women get told. But yeah, I think if I were to be most generous, I think people are trying to do what they're supposed to do. I think most people are good-hearted, maybe a little soft-headed, and they're trying to do the right thing, what society is expected of them as men and women. And what does society expect of women? These days in the West, it's kind of like being a boss bitch, and you have to be everything. And you have to have the corporate job and a mother of three, and you hand write all of your birthday thank you cards, and you go to Pilates 8 times a week, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think for men in the intersexual space, it's you have to defer to women, you have to treat them like equals, which I think in the male imagination often gets translated as women are the same as you, and they want the same things as you. And treating them like you would treat a man is sort of the pathway to success. And I think that in general, relationships are suffering because women are treating men like women, and men are treating women like men. And it's almost, I think we've turned a corner a little bit in the last year or so, but just to state that men and women are different, like maybe fundamentally, it has been, it could melt the internet. Like it's anathema to think that way.
Well, it's created a war because we're in distortion. That's what I was told. That's what I believed when I went to the University of Toronto. This was in the late 80s, and feminism was alive and well. And I thought I was being good by making the assumption that women were just like men. And I proceeded that way for years until I dated a woman from Texas, kind of nice Southern lady who set me straight very quickly. It's like, I don't know what you're doing, but I'm a lady and I want to be treated as a lady. and I didn't know what to do with that initially, but over time it really felt good and right. And then I started to crave a more traditional relationship. But I felt shame about it. I felt that that was not a good thing to do. And with my wife, we've sort of landed in a traditional relationship, and we're both very happy in that dynamic. But both of us had to let go of images and judgment about our part in that. She didn't feel comfortable not working or not making money, not contributing in that way. She felt it was weak, or she was betraying, women in some way. So, there's a lot of distortion out there. People are unhappy, and I guess this is where you show up. Like, it's almost like you're like the man for the moment. I mean, I know there's a lot of people out there talking about this, and I don't mean to like blow smoke up your ass, but it does have to be named. Like, there is a way that you you're speaking to something that's really important, and you are articulating it in a way that people can hear. Because there's a lot of people saying similar things, like in the red pill community. You've heard not exactly what you're saying, but things similar. And but it comes with this tone of resentment. You feel that they're, not all of them, but many of them are kind of angry at women, and it's hard to really take it in. And of course, women are going to be triggered by that. They're going to be suspicious of that. They're not going to listen to it. They're not going to trust it. But there's a way that you have of delivering the information. I mean, I noticed with the questions I asked, like the way that you're very fair-minded, very deliberate about building a large frame so that people feel heard and understood. And I guess the question is, after all of that, did you have an intuition that, I mean, obviously you must have known at a certain point in your life that you were an excellent communicator, that you knew how to string sentences together and convey complex ideas. Did you have an intuition that you were going to have an impact?
Oh, well, I didn't know that I would have the impact that I currently have today. That wasn't necessarily my expectation. My hopes for the channel were much more modest. I remember when I got to 1,000 subscribers, I thought that I was like over the moon. I mean, that was more people than I would act in front of on the stage in a year in New York City. And they were, if I was a teacher, which I was for 20 years, to have a lecture hall with 1,000 people, I mean, I think social media has distorted our sense of number on some level. It's like a turnout at 1,000 people. 1,000 people show up to your funeral, you're like an important person in your community. That's huge. So, I mean, I had never thought that I would get this far, but I'm very grateful for the way things are going. I think I've always been pretty good with words. I was in speech and debate in high school. I went to the national championships when I was like 14. I started acting when I was 13, albeit against my will. It's something that I think, because I'm not the biggest guy, I'm 5'11", but I'm not the most athletic guy. I've played some sports. I'm not the most attractive guy. I certainly wasn't the most popular guy. So it's like I had to find some kind of niche to find a place in the world. I used to think it was my intelligence. And I realized that intelligence is very good, but women don't want to fuck you just because you're smart. Like, that doesn't happen. And smartness can lead to wealth. It can lead to success. It can lead to humor. Like, I think you have to be smart to be funny. And women do respond to those things, but they don't respond directly to, let's say, being able to do differential equations, as it were, It is really interesting, though, David. Like, I'm still pretty much the same guy, but the number of women who have DM'd me in the last year saying that they love the way I think is very suspicious, because I had never heard that from a woman before in my entire life, and I'm not thinking very different in the past year than I did in previous years. I think it just might have to do with the fact that I'm now reaching, 10 or 20 million people a month. But they can't say that, or they might not even be conscious of that, but like they're responding more to the fame or the status than let's say, my actual ideology. But to go
Well,
back to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
well, you have a lot of power.
I'm still trying to figure out to what extent that's true. Being a social media personality it's very strange. Like, you have power to an extent from those who know who you are, but I'm completely invisible and just an average normal person to everybody else. And yes, I suppose I have the ability to direct attention towards certain issues or topics or towards certain guests, but there's also much bigger fish in the sea as well.
Well,
So,
it's the power that you have, obviously, because you've become a social media star, but also you have personal power in that you're in command of yourself. Like, you know what the fuck you're talking about, and you articulate it in a very strong way. And you, there's something about the way you look, and
oh,
there's something, and also your name.
okay.
Orion Taraban. I mean, like, that's a very unique, interesting name. Like, the avatar that you are online is very interesting
Oh,
because,
interesting.
even because when I saw you the first time, it's like I felt like I'd seen you before somehow.
Oh,
It's kind of like an actor when you see them in a movie. They're just meant to be on TV, and it's that you just buy them right away, and there's a kind of a familiarity with them instantaneously, and you have that. Well, from my perspective, you have that quality,
that's
and
fascinating. I haven't thought
yeah,
so much about that. I generally have just had my head down, focused on producing my content. But I am pulling back on my content production. I went down from 2 episodes to 1 episode a week recently, and I think I'm having some space to consider, what this moment means and what's possible given, what's occurred over the last few years.
yeah. I can imagine that your mind must be running with all kinds of ideas about to capitalize on it, for the reason to have the most impact.
Well, yeah, there's definitely a temptation there. So, I'm an entrepreneur as well. I have a number of businesses. I've never worked for somebody else. Actually, I worked once. My first job out of college was with the Princeton Review doing SAT prep.
Well, as an actor, you're working for somebody else. That's
Oh,
what I
yeah.
realized when I got to Hollywood. I'm like, I'm an actor, and I'm like, I'm a cog in a wheel working for Warner Brothers. I'm just on the factory line.
You're absolutely correct. I guess I didn't consider that because I never really made any money from acting. I never got into film and TV, which is where the money is. I was in theater, and you just get paid with exposure and an honorarium from time to time. So, I don't really consider that as a career, which is part of why I got out of it. Like, it was just too hard to make a living that way.
Yeah, fair enough.
But I'm full of ideas. Like, I have at least 5 different projects that probably would take a year to really build up to fruition, and I have to figure out which, if any, I do and in what order, and I'm cognizant of not being too much of a shill. Like, I still have not done any kind of paid advertisements on Psychax, and I think it leaves a lot of money on the table as far as I can tell, but I do think that if I start to shill, I'm not saying I'm above it, but I'd probably be a very expensive shill. It would decrease my credibility. So, one of the accusations that's often leveled against folks in this space are that, I'm a grifter and I'm just trying to, like, capitalize on men's anger or their misguided hopes to sell my products, and I don't really have much to sell. I have my book, I have my community, but, I don't
Is
sell, like, 10 steps to, getting the girl of your dreams kind of a thing.
Yeah, I know you're totally in your integrity. Like, it comes off that way. There's no grifter vibe at all. At least
Oh,
how
that's
I
good.
experienced you, and because there's a lot of them out there. So, do you miss the creativity of acting? I mean, I know what you're doing in some sense is creative. Obviously, writing a book is a creative project, and there's a kind of poetry in your writing, the use of metaphor, and
Oh,
there's a
thanks.
nice flow to it. Are you creatively satisfied through this work?
Yeah, I think I am. I think Psychax is my little stage right now, so I do get to get in front of people. It's not quite the same visceral, immediate sensation of getting in front of a live audience, but it is nice to know that, what I say and what I do it has reception. It's very difficult to be, I mean, I don't know about you, but I've acted to two people.
Yeah.
It's demoralizing. It's very hard to keep going. Right now, I'm actually working on a piece of fiction about the final days of Van Gogh. So very different from what I have been working with in the relationship space. But this is a story that I've been taking with me for the last 25 years. I actually wrote a one-act play about it in college when I was 19. I'm fascinated by these last few days of Van Gogh. And so it's about madness and art and creativity and faith and hope and science, a novel of ideas, as it were. So I get a lot of creative expression. I'm very grateful for that.
Do you have a sense of why you're drawn to that story?
I haven't. Well, certainly, I'm drawn to it for its its narrative possibilities. So a lot of people know that Vincent van Gogh killed himself. He shot himself, but he missed, and he's trying to shoot himself in his heart, but he missed his heart. So it took him 2 days to die. So the book is about those 2 days between when he shot himself and when he actually passed away. And in my imagination, thinking about, well, what actually changes for a person inside when they go from being actively suicidal to now they're still alive, but they have a concrete death sentence.
That's a really interesting premise. Go ahead.
It's sort of, I watched a documentary a long time ago about, I think it was called The Bridge, and it's about the Golden Gate Bridge, which I think, at least until recently, maybe still was the #1 suicide site in the world. And the documentary was able to track down some of the survivors. And like, without fail, their common experience was as soon as they cleared the bar and gravity took over, was, what the fuck did I just do? And as they're free falling, they're basically praying for a second chance and a survival. And of course, most of them don't, unfortunately. But I think that's a very interesting premise. Aaron Beck talked about how suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem, or it's based on poor insight or decision making. And to what extent do people just want to escape pain versus no longer want to exist? And of course, Van Gogh is fascinating because he sold one painting in his lifetime, which is why I brought this up. It's like his paintings now are valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. He hangs in the best galleries in the world, but he was completely unknown and disrespected and unregarded in his lifetime. And, what impact does that have on a person? Day after day, month after month, year after year, to be ignored, to have no place in the world, to be unacknowledged. And I think that's the experience of a lot of men today.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's what you'll be exploring. I mean, that's a really interesting premise. And I guess you have to explore his psychology, speculate what might be going on in his mind, the stories he's telling himself, the regret, the remorse, the pain. I don't know, but that there's a lot of possibility there. That must be a really interesting, and I guess to me it sounds challenging.
It's extremely challenging. It's so much harder than writing nonfiction, which seems to progress along a more or less rational argument. Now, I know what needs to happen in terms of the narrative progression, but like, no one sentence naturally follows from another. Like, every time I finish a sentence, it's like I'm in the wilderness and I can go in any direction from here. So it's been much slower to write than the nonfiction. I am setting my sights lower. I'm shooting for a novella, maybe around 100 pages. But, it's been challenging and frustrating, and I'd like to keep at it. So that's my project for the next few months.
That's amazing. So you're on fire. You said you have all these creative ideas. Are you, I don't know, what is your relationship like with work? Like I'm assuming because you're so consistent that you have a very good routine, you're disciplined, you're able to churn it out relatively quickly with relative ease. I know writing can be challenging, but it seems like from the outside looking in, you're in a pretty good flow.
I've learned some things about myself. Like, for example, when it comes to writing, I don't write if I have less than 3 hours of free time. because it takes me a while to get into it and I want to make some progress. If I just do 15 minutes here, 15 minutes there, it doesn't work and the product is too disjointed. When it comes to psych hacks, I write a bunch of scripts, I batch the recordings so I can create a buffer for myself. I only see clients on certain days. I don't really think of this as work though. It's clearly, what I do to make money, but I've never had a case of the Mondays, which is something that I made a conscious decision to myself not to ever do when I was younger. I never wanted to live a life where I dreaded Monday, where I dreaded what I had to do to make money. And that meant I had to be poor for a long time until something started to click. And it wasn't psych hacks. It was something else that clicked before then. But it's really important. I could not work a 9 to 5. I know that about myself. I would rather do something drastic than work that kind of a job.
What do you say to guys who come in and who are working the 9 to 5, who have the fear Monday morning? I'm sure you talk to a lot of those guys. What do you say to them right now?
Well, not everyone is me, and a lot of guys are more conventional. I'm very unconventional, and they would not thrive in an entrepreneurial, self-directed environment. Some people need that. I mean, we all need structure, but some people need that externally imposed structure way more than they're willing to admit to themselves and to others. So if I'm dealing with a very conventional person, I would not take them or guide them towards an unconventional lifestyle. It just would be a poor match for them. They might learn a lot, but I don't think that they would thrive under those circumstances.
How do we get more men to therapy? Because or consulting or some kind of psychological exploration, or maybe you don't think that they should be, but I just you say that, and then I think about Alex Hormozi and these guys out there who just you got to do it. You got to work 12 hours a day. You got to make this money. You got to start your own business. And I great if you resonate with that, but it does set a standard that is not realistic for a lot of men, for the reasons you just said. Some men need to be working for other people. They need the structure. And so I guess, and maybe even for me, I've found I'm all of these ideas out there about how it's supposed to be, I think can get very confusing. And I guess I'm not sure what the question is, but I guess my bias is find some place to understand yourself, to know yourself, to figure out what it is you want, and then move from that place.
Sorry, you froze for a second there. So
okay.
Could you repeat the question, please? Just the last part, because I think everything up to that was the prelude.
Yeah. No, it's all good. Yeah, well, it's just how do we? I mean, there's so much information out there for men. They're getting bombarded with all kinds of ideas and images, and I think even for me, it gets confusing. I can get lost when I get on social media, and then I have all these ideas in my head about how it's supposed to be and what I should be doing, and I forget sometimes about who I am and what's right for me.
Yeah.
And so, and I have a bias because of what I do, and I believe in it, and I'm interested in it, and it's helped me a lot. And I guess the question is, how do you get guys to self-examine, to be more reflective about who they are and their experiences, to be able to have conversations like this about their emotions, about their feelings, about their fears, about their desires, and it's not seen as weak or shameful.
Okay, yeah. A lot of questions there. Big topic. I think on the whole, it's great that we have people like Alex Hormozi in the space. I'm glad that he exists, and I resonate with a lot of his content. By the same token, not everyone is going to be a jacked billionaire, So we're just not all on extraordinary paths like Alex. He might disagree and say everyone could be. I think there might be the potential for that to be true, but in practical reality, it's just so far away from where most people are. It's not because they're not getting up at 5 a.m. for a cold plunge or whatever it is that these folks are recommending. But I'm really glad that we hear from him, because he does have a lot of good advice, and it could be true, especially because he's at the spear tip of what it might be possible as a male entrepreneur. But to what extent that's actually relevant to the average person's working experience. I'm not particularly sure, but I'm glad he exists. To answer your question, I do think that 90% of successful relationships has to do with selection. And I believe that's true for romantic relationships and professional relationships. And a lot of that has to do with accurate self-knowledge. You have to know what actually works for you, not what you think should work for you, not what you think you want to work for you, but what actually works for you and what doesn't work for you. So to give an example from my personal life, I got to about 27 and I realized that it would be very difficult for me to continue on as a professional actor. So I got to a place where, for various reasons, I no longer wanted to be an actor, but I didn't know that I wanted to be a psychologist yet. So there was like a year and a half between not wanting to be an actor and wanting to be a psychologist, where it was a very uncomfortable place to be because I was in an in-between space and I didn't know who I was or where I wanted to move towards. And what I did is I was very ruthlessly honest about who I was and what worked for me. And I set just a few different criteria, I think maybe 6 or 7. And based on those criteria, there were only like 2 or 3 jobs or career paths that met all of those criteria. And then I did some due diligence about those 2 or 3 paths and chose psychology, which turned out to be an excellent fit for me. Like, I'm by nature an introvert. So getting on, you remember my origin story for acting, I could do it. And it was really good for me to come out of my shell and learn about my body and my voice and my presence and to be able to turn on charm and extroversion, but it never felt natural. And the people who succeed in that space, it's not just because of what they do on stage or on camera. They have to go to parties. They have to hobnob with the right people. They have to keep relationships warm. That has never been my forte. And in terms of practical career elements, that was going to make it so I was going to fall flat in the industry, as it were, from my perspective. So, some of these things that I had to decide for myself are not very socially acceptable. Like, I had to come to terms for the fact that I'm not a team player. That's not something you're supposed to say. Like, if I go to a job interview and like, can you work well on a team? Nah, I'm kind of a lone wolf. I don't want to fucking deal with people. They kind of get in my way. They slow me down. They're often wrong, Well, how are you good at taking feedback? Not well. I like to be the boss. I kind of want to be the guy in charge. I'm not really good at following orders. You knew that
about yourself.
Well, sure. It was probably part of my frustrations with being an actor is I realized that the people who really had the power were the directors, the casting directors, the producers, et cetera. And I just had to stand there on some level and say my line. I didn't really have a lot of power over the course of my career. I had some influence, obviously, but not enough for me to feel secure in choosing that career path long term. So, like, I wanted to be the boss. I wanted to work individually as opposed to a part of a team. I like working one-on-one as opposed to groups. I tend to get lost in all of the information overload because if there's 3 people, there's A and B, A and C, B and C, and A, B, and C. There's 4 different relationships that you're tracking. And, it just increases more or less exponentially as you add people, and it's like information overload. I don't know what to do. So I'm really good at one-on-one. I wanted to do something that was actually helpful to people. Mm-hmm. Up until that time, my main income source was private tutoring, which was interesting, but I didn't really feel like I was helping the world by teaching rich kids how to conjugate Latin or to prepare the SATs or whatever it is. And I wanted to make a certain amount of money because I was tired of being poor. I was living in public housing in Brooklyn at the time. So, and I had to work with my words and my ideas because I'm not very handy. Those are like 5 or 6 criteria. And there's only a few different careers. There was psychologist, there was lawyer, but then I'd have to be a lawyer, or like medical doctor. And I just didn't have it in me to go to med school. So it's like, let's research psychology. I talked to some psychologists. I did some due diligence and I, rolled the dice. And it turned out to be a great fit. But the same goes for relationships. Like, one of the things that I've learned is that I'm better when I'm in charge. I'm better when I'm in the more dominant role, when I'm directing and leading the relationship. Doesn't mean that I expect that I have unquestioning compliance and obedience from the women that I date, but it's like, we're not in an egalitarian relationship. It's I'm here, and that comes with certain privileges and also some responsibilities. And you're coming into something that has already been constructed before you showed up. So it's the metaphor I give in the book is that captains build the ship so they're best suited to dictate its course because they actually know how the ship works. You wouldn't ask a passenger who just showed up to man the helm, as it were. And that rubs some folks the wrong way, especially in the Bay Area, which is there's a lot of left-leaning thought that runs counter to that relationships should be in all respects egalitarian and exactly equal. And I found that when I've tried to do that in the past, it led to poor outcomes. And now it's like this kind of doesn't work for everyone, but it's also useful because like women can self-select in and out. Like they
That's right.
also more or less know what works for them and what they want. And trust me, there's a lot of women who don't want to be the person running the show. Here's an example. We talked about a few minutes ago differences in gendered perception of just around the role of, let's say, respect and equality. So one of the things that I would do, if we were going to make plans, David, as a sign of respect, I would kind of like defer judgment to you. It's like, well, where do you want to go, David? Like, what kind of food do you want to eat? Because I'd want to, that's a sign of respect. I'm taking your interests and tastes into account. But unfortunately, I think that when you do that in a dating context, a lot of women see that as wishy-washy, as unmasculine, as weak, for lack of a better word. What I've discovered just in this very small...
It is weak because you're on some level, you're trying to please them and they can feel that. Like you want to be good for them. Like, what do you want? Like that, it's that energy that I think is repulsive to them. It doesn't necessarily have to be that. It can be polite, but very often it's what you said, like men defer to women or they want to be liked by them and they give away their power. And it leaves women with a feeling of, they don't respect it.
Well, yeah, I've had much better success just saying, hey, I want to go, let's go out on this day at this time to this place, meet me here. And, they either say yes or say no. But that's in one very small way how being more directive and dominant with women can lead to better outcomes in dating and relationships. The same thing, there's an element of deference in respect that can be misinterpreted in intersexual dynamics. Another big thing I've talked about on the channel is that respect is asexual. Like from
Say
a masculine, well, think about all of the ceremonies that are really based on respect, like an award ceremony or a funeral. It's like sexualizing the object of honor would be completely disgusting and inappropriate. It's like the person who is being respected, we strip all sexualization away from that person. They're at odds with each other. And so I think we have a generation or maybe a couple generations of men who have been told to respect women. And one of the consequences of that is they've more or less stripped all of their communication from any kind of any sexual interest or desire. Because you don't desire and respect simultaneously. Maybe you can vacillate between the two of them in some strange compromise, but I think if you want to, you would not feel respected if you were sexualized as a consequence of that honoring. If you were, then we're doing honor wrong in our ceremonies. We should be sexualizing the recipients of that respect. And I think men, when they're dealing with women in the sexual marketplace and in dating, they inadvertently and inappropriately remove their sexual desire and interest as if it's something to be ashamed of, something that's at odds with respect, which is ultimately what women want. And I think that leads to poorer outcomes. Of course, these men haven't ceased desiring women sexually, but which creates this sort of like weird deceptiveness and hypocrisy around dating that can feel creepy, which is sort of like the nice guy paradox.
Yeah, I don't think women want to be respected. They to enough of a degree, they want to be, they preference desire over respect. They want to feel that a man desires them.
Yeah, I hear you. It's a tough sell. to say women don't want to be respected. David Sutcliffe, right?
I mean, it's kind of what you just said, though. Like, don't respect women. Like, I was hearing the woman in the comments, like, so what are you saying, Orion? I shouldn't mention respect women, but it's not what you're saying. It's a very nuanced thing, but but my experience, yeah, of course, respect, but it's not the kind of respect that you afford to a man. Or a certain situation. It's a different thing. It's simply because women are so, well, one, we're attracted to them and there's a sexual component to them. So that throws everything off in terms of how you relate to them. And that the energy of sexuality and desire, it overpowers everything. I mean, it really is the strongest force out there. So it's almost like you have the desire is a kind of respect if it's coming from a place that is respectful, something like that.
I hear that. Like, some women can feel disrespected if the men that they are attracted to don't try to sleep with them.
That's right.
They feel it's like, what are you, gay? Like, you don't like what you see here?
I had that. It's like, why are you trying to get in my pants? I was like, I'm trying to be, I don't know. They were upset because I was being good. And then I got over that.
Michael Sartain talks about how in his conceptualization, there's actually like 3 genders. There are women, and there are low status men and high status men.
Yeah.
And they're almost like 2 different creatures. And the issue is that women want to be desired by the men they want desire from. And they really don't want desire from the men they don't want desire from. But it's impossible in most cases for the man to know in which camp he finds himself until he shoots his shot.
Well, what do we do about that? Because if we just leave it to the dynamics, won't we be a polygamous society? Like, is this idea of enforced monogamy that you've heard Jordan Peterson reference? Like, it does make sense to me, because otherwise you have this group of young men filled with testosterone. Although I guess if they're jerking off to porn all the time, that goes down. They're kind of subdued in some way. But that's a dangerous precedent for a society to have a bunch of young disaffected men. Eventually that they're going to get together and probably create a lot of problems. So, like, what do we do with low status men?
Yeah, that's the theory, is that if there's too many young men in particular who don't have access to women, they'll band together and become like
ISIS.
It's kind of like they'll channel their sexual frustration into, let's say, societal antisocial tendencies.
Well, dude, if I was 21 and I wasn't getting laid and there was no possibility for me getting laid, I would like join a gang and start fucking shit up. What else am I going to do?
Well, you would watch porn and smoke weed.
Well, there's that.
Which is generally what happens. Like, gangs still exist, but there's far more young men watching porn and smoking weed than they're joining the Crips or whatever it is, you know? So that's actually a bigger social neutralizer. And the fact of the matter is that we've reached this point in our society where we don't need everyone to be productive in order for society to be functioning. And that's dangerous from the perspective of, like, we're all collectively falling short of our social and civic potential in that way. But that's where we've reached. It's kind of a decadence that often precedes collapse, and then the values and the systems get recalibrated. But I'm not concerned about sexless men joining together into violent gangs. There's too many other seductive anesthesias that will capture them before antisocial violence.
It feels sad to me. I prefer the antisocial violence. There's something about a group of men subdued on porn and weed that just feels anti-life. But that is what it is. What do we do about that? What is there something to do, or is this just what's happening? And as you said, it precedes collapse, and this is where we're at, and it'll remake itself in some way after the collapse.
Yeah, I think the game never ends. It just keeps changing and transforming over time. I certainly don't feel like there's grounds to become nihilistic or overly pessimistic about the future. It's like some things will fall apart, other things will remain, and we'll have a new synthesis moving forward. And that's never going to stop. What do we do about it? I mean, I don't know if or to what extent the solution can be social.
Mm.
I think that it comes from, I think that the young men that have been ensnared in certain ways, they need an installation of hope, and they need help. And I don't just mean they need therapy. They need people who are invested in their lives and invested in their success to walk with them as they build a life worth living.
Mm.
And hope is a very dangerous thing. I learned about this because my pre-doc internship for 2 years was at the Cancer Support Community in Walnut Creek, California, which is a fascinating organization. It's a nonprofit. All the services are completely free of charge. And for a couple of years, I was doing individual and group therapy with cancer patients and their caregivers. And hope is a really tricky thing. Like, we need it way more than we typically admit. But there comes a time where hope it's causing more pain than good.
Because it creates a false expectation? Sets them up for disappointment?
I mean, yeah. Most people who pass away from cancer, they typically don't die right away. You know, they get diagnosed. Sometimes they get diagnosed too late, and then they do chemo. Okay, and maybe that causes a remission for a year or two, and then the cancer comes back, and now they do radiation or more intensive surgeries if that's possible, and that leads to a remission for a certain amount of time. The point is that, like, you keep doing things because you have a hope that you can eventually kill the disease and live cancer-free for the rest of your days. And there comes a point where the likelihood of that occurring is just very, very low, if not non-existent. But it's not something that I found you can disabuse other people of. Like, people have to come to their own decision in their own time to kill the hope. And this is like the black pill movement that people have been talking about a lot in the last few years, where you just have these hopeless men that they will never have a satisfying relationship with a woman. Their lives will never amount to anything. To my mind, I mean, I can understand that. Like, I felt so hopeless when I was a young man, but that was a lie. That was a lie. And it's a very easy lie to see through because, like, when have you fucking tried? Like,
Yeah.
like, you can give up when you've tried everything. Then it's the important thing to potentially let go and to pass on with some sort of dignity and acceptance. But if you've tried one or two things and it hasn't worked, it's like it's too early to lay down and die, in my opinion. So I think that people need hope, but hope is a painful thing. I think a lot of these young men are trying to make themselves believe that it's hopeless because it
Right.
might be more comfortable to completely kill the hope.
Well, if
Because
they're hopeless, there's no responsibility. They don't have to take responsibility for their lives ultimately and do the hard work of making something of themselves.
it is very hard work. I talk about that on the channel and in the book. Being a young man is really hard. It's really tough. That's why they're the cannon fodder. Like, no
Yeah.
one cries that an 18-year-old man has been killed. They're expendable.
Yeah, yeah, they really are. I mean, I felt that as a young man, when I was being told that it's a man's world and men run the world and women are not equal. I was like, that's not how it feels to me. That's not my experience of it. And I grew up in a home where my mother was pretty dominant and my grandmother was pretty dominant. So it was more matriarchal. So that I had that image. But in terms of power, and I think you allude to this in your book, or where you say it directly, that in general, women actually have more power than men. I mean, on the simplest level, it's women and children first. It's like, when it comes down to it, you live, I die. So in that sense, they ultimately do have more power, and in that sense, I guess they should.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, like, I like my life. I don't. I mean, from
But
a like from
you know that you have to lay it down for your woman if it comes to that. I mean, you don't have to, but most of us would, or we'd think that that was the right thing. And if you didn't do that, you'd be criticized, judged, you'd be a social pariah generally. Or is that changing?
certain. Oh no, you would certainly be judged, and probably the guilt associated with not doing it if you were to survive and the woman didn't would eat you up inside. But I question. I think the argument is made that that's sort of like a biological imperative in males to protect, and that might be true. But I wonder to what extent it's also like fucking brainwashing. It's like kamikaze pilots. And it's like you serve the social order by making a sacrifice of your life. And it's like, fuck that. Like I want more for my life than simply being a sacrifice potentially for the good of others, including women and children. Like I actually want more for my life than that. And that is dangerous because it's useful to have a subclass of men who are already primed up to be useful sacrifices.
And so I guess what you're implying is that there's a structure there. There's a brainwashing that people want to keep in place because it serves them.
I mean, if we're really going into sexual egalitarianism, it's like we can't use gender as the sine qua non to decide who lives and who dies in certain situations. Like, do we do a utilitarian analysis? Now we're getting into like the trolley car problem. It's like, some men, they might do more good to more people than, a woman and a child. Who knows? But it's like
true. We on the Titanic, we should have lined everybody up and see who was most necessary. And there's a couple of maybe a number of women that would have had to get in the water. Who knows?
And I'm glad I'm not in a position to judge. But my point is that I do think that, I mean, can we even look at that critically, or does it feel too transgressive to even consider that men should not just reflexively be the sacrifice, to be the one who lays down their lives?
Yeah, I agree with that. So, I mean, I'll ask you it's a broad question. You can answer it any way you want, but what should men do at this moment of time? Like, what's the best course of action? What's the way that they should be thinking about their lives and what they should be doing? Like, what's the best advice that you give?
What was really helpful for me was radical responsibility and to just make a commitment to stop blaming anyone for my problems, to stop blaming my parents, to stop blaming society, to stop blaming my ex-girlfriends or what have you. It's like my best choices brought me to this place. And so I'm fundamentally responsible. If this woman betrayed me, who chose her? If these friends didn't help me in my time of need, who made them my friends? Et cetera, et cetera. So it's like to make a strong commitment to stop finding blame in external causes and to see myself in a more agentic fashion, that I am the source of my decisions, and for better or for ill. And I can, by taking responsibility, I can learn and respond more effectively moving forward. That was a huge help for me. I stopped doing drugs. Like, it's very difficult, especially weed. Weed is far more dangerous than people think. And I think it's dangerous because it seduces you into thinking you're using your time constructively. I remember I'd get high and I would just I could watch paint dry and I would think that that was a good use of my time. Lots of things make sense or seem brilliant when you're intoxicated, and then in the light of day, it's like, oh my God. So, and there's also the time recovering from drug use as well. So it's like to move in the direction of clarity, which might actually bring you into contact with your pain more. This is something that I've talked about too, is that it might be helpful to remove the anesthesia, broadly defined, whether that's porn or weed or booze or overwork in an unsatisfying job, et cetera, who knows? To remove those sources of anesthesia, to come into greater contact with your pain, because in general, misery is unsustainable. A lot of guys are living like C- lives, maybe D+ lives. And it's just like, just bearable. Like, if I just do this, that, or the other, if I can just get to Friday, then maybe I can. It's like, and it's week after week and week after week of this. But if they were living D- lives, they would understand that that's unsustainable, and they might take more urgent constructive action to change the structure of their lives. So sometimes it's a good idea to increase temporarily one's receptivity to one's pain, because pain is the great motivator. That's what motivated me to do all kinds of things, is the desire to not experience it as much anymore. And I don't, which is great, which creates its own problems, which create new pain, which keep me on the right track, as it were.
Yeah, I was going to let you go, but I let me just ask you one more question, because that
Sure.
topic, it really resonated with me. The discussion about pain and tolerating discomfort, and in my work, which, my work is somatic, core energetics is what I'm trained in, so it's very physical. But when I'm working with somebody in that realm, all I'm thinking about is trying to lead them to their pain, so that they can make contact with and feel their pain, knowing that's the liberation point. And that so much of what we're doing in the world, whether it's smoking weed, whether it's watching pornography or wasting time, is really a kind of avoidance of our pain, and that we will avoid taking certain actions. We will avoid coming into contact with certain people because of what they might bring up inside us, the feelings they might bring up inside us. So I'm often thinking about, like, if I'm in greater contact with my pain, if I'm not afraid to feel my pain, if I'm able to tolerate it in some way, that I'm actually a lot more free, because I'm no longer governed by it. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, you do a lot of things to avoid pain, which often creates more avoidable pain than just experiencing the pain itself. I described it to my therapist that I had this frozen lake of pain that was just like right in the middle of my chest. I couldn't feel it, but I knew that it was there because it was frozen. And part of that was based on just the fear that if I were to access that, that I would just be overwhelmed by the grief, by the sadness. That if I were to open that door, it would be like the ocean rushing through and I would drown. And that's not true. I don't think an emotion has ever killed somebody. People have done things under certain emotions that have been more harmful, but emotions themselves, if you can learn to experience and tolerate them, it's okay. I do think that you have to feel it, feel it to heal it, right? But it's like the feeling of the emotion, in my non-scientific conceptualization, is that emotion leaving your body. It's like how you taste your food when you vomit it. That you're tasting it is signs that it's leaving your body. And until the feeling, as difficult as that might be, is a positive sign, because it means like you're vomiting it, you're discharging it, you're getting it out. So you don't have to hold it inside of you. The issue for me and for a lot of guys was, I was sold on the idea of like, okay, as scary as that is, maybe I do have to feel it. Maybe I do have to experience it. So how do I do that? Like, should I read a book? Like, do I push a button? Like, I'm ready to feel my feelings. It took a while for me to be able to access that. And the suggestion from my therapist was just to set time. I think it was twice a day, to sit down and just see what was inside, like just to feel, just to sit and to notice what was going on inside of my body. And sometimes I would sit and I'd feel like a total schmuck. I'd be like, that was a waste of time and nothing happened. And then sometimes, I was able to access that and I'd start to cry, and that was inconvenient, So I'd learned to kind of turn the spigot back on it after 20 minutes or so I could move on with my day. And then, like, slowly over time, I drained the sadness and the grief out of me. I don't know if it's a permanent thing that you do once and for all, but I don't feel that in my chest anymore anyway. And I do think that I think you might have to cry more tears than you think. but eventually the tears dry up. Like, you don't have to keep forcing it. You don't have to force it at all, really. And then it's very easy to let go of something because you've like seen it through. You've plumbed to the bottom, and so it no longer holds a fascination. And then it's very simple to let it go.
Orion Taraban, thank you.
David, this was great.